When Brooklyn Nets Media Day comes a-calling, you drop everything, especially when it turns out that there's actual legitimate content to take away from this. Insightful questions from the media, legitimate, honest, and open responses from everyone on the Brooklyn Nets, starting first and foremost with Kevin Durant. We dive in on his perspective and replies to the offseason and the path ahead for the Brooklyn Nets.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn, yo. Yes, sir. Welcome into the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. We, of course, thank you for making your first listen today, free on all those great platforms. Over there, you're going to find Doug Norrie, owner-operator DFSR, for all your daily fantasy sports rankings from DraftKings to FanDuel. He's got you covered. I'm Adam Armbrecht, breaking down the New York Football Giants coming up on Monday night, all season long on the One Giant podcast with my boy Andy Mack. And Doug, we dive in here as the media day. We know Brooklyn Nets, a lot of teams, I think 28 out of the 30 teams, 27 out of the 30 teams had media sessions today on Monday. Everyone came to the podium. Our intention right off the top, before we let Doug speak, it was to maybe cover this in an episode because it's media day and it all becomes boilerplate until the questions started getting asked. And all of a sudden we realized there was really some insights around what has happened over the last several months and even over the last couple of years in a lot of ways. So today, Doug, we focus on Kevin Durant, and then all week long, we're going to talk about Kyrie Irving and then talk about Sean Marks and really the big takeaways from this media day here at the top with the number one star, Kevin Durant.
Yeah, I was shocked. It was so good. It was really, really interesting media day. It's still going, by the way, just for the show programming note, it's still going on as we record this. So Steve Nash is actually talking now. So, but we made it a point to say, hey, we're going to go player by player, because at first, like you said, it was very much like, okay, we'll just cover what everyone said because mostly it's a bunch of sound bites and you can just move on with your life. And that's just how these things usually go. Except the Nets, in Nets fashion, have so many storylines, and the players, I thought, were just brutally honest in a great way. And for the most part, I thought the media held everyone kind of accountable here. That I do think it was such a fruitful day in terms of what we got to see from these different guys. So we'll start with Durant. We'll cover Durant on today's episode because there's definitely enough there after a summer of just a whirlwind anti-courtship or whatever you would call it. That happened.
Divorce imminent, counseling, and you know what? We're gonna stick it out for the kids.
And hopefully on YouTube we'll get Kyrie and Ben Simmons up before, a little sooner than the podcast would be. So make sure you subscribe over on YouTube. But in general, yeah, man, from a media day perspective, Durant brought it, and it's not from him. It's not surprising because he's always been a really honest dude. I think in a way that does kind of push back on how athletes generally tend to interact with the media and with just like the fans at large.
Yeah, and I think we're going to dive in on, he was asked about the trade request, how he feels about not being traded, what were some of the issues that led to that request. And there, again, to your point, it's just there's insightful responses here, but I do just want to quickly touch on something about this media day session that felt like, for the players, obviously, a reset of narratives around them and trying to get back on level footing here going into the season. For the organization, it felt like the same thing too. Like, let's clean it up here. Everybody, teams across the league were doing Zoom calls last season. No people in the room, no direct eye contact with those that are asking you questions. So not necessarily a level of accountability, not from the players or the organization side, but from the media side. And I got a real sense, and I push back on it if you think I'm nuts here, because I don't want to be reading tea leaves. But to me, it felt like the Brooklyn Nets organization said to Kevin Durant and the entire team, and then also to the media, hey, we're not having a circus. Like, we're not doing it again. So when you come in, you're going to be asked questions. We expect you to give reasonably honest and direct responses. And that goes both ways for the media. Don't come in here and start dragging up old narratives from the past 2 seasons. There's things that are relevant from this offseason we can address. And then we want to talk about where we are going forward here, because otherwise you get caught in this spiral of always perceiving and maintaining a narrative around these players and around this team that is going to become old hat in about 4 days when the first preseason game starts.
Yeah, there was definitely a very professional tenor to this, and but also it was like, hey, we're not going to be able to dodge questions. This offseason's been a mess. The last season was a mess. Like, obviously, you're going to get questions about this stuff. We'll talk a little bit about maybe one or two questions that were conveniently not asked, but by and large, not like anything was being hidden here. But no, I thought that all this stuff had to be addressed. There was too much that had to happen. There was too much that had happened with this team. A lot of it negative, right? Just between, I mean, we don't need to run through the whole list. The last calendar year has been a total disaster for this team. Yep. That was not going to be, it had to be accounted for in some way, right? I think Durant did that. I think Kyrie, who we'll talk about tomorrow, did that. Simmons did it. He was some of his responses I thought were funny. But in general, though, I agree with you. It was like, hey, we can't, both sides cannot do a media circus here. You cannot dictate to the media what they can ask. But you can set the tone for what your organization is going to be like and what you're going to be willing to talk about. They did not dodge any questions here. Everything was answered. I thought refreshingly, honestly, by just about everyone involved, including Durant, who I thought had one of the most honest responses to something that I've heard in quite some time. We'll talk about that in a second. But yes, in general, on a high level, this was as much as good as you can ask for an organization that easily could have been a total circus. Like, this could have been an easy circus atmosphere with, getting mad at the media getting more, rankled and riled up, and then, and, not of no fault of theirs, but that just didn't happen. And I really almost always expect nothing from these things. Like, my expectations on this stuff are so low.
Everyone does, right? Our entire network, the Locked On Network, we prepare for these things and you want to get insightful quotes, but we're having discussions among the hosts saying, if we get a couple of lines out of this thing, we'll be really excited. Instead, you and I are going, okay, page 4 here. We've got quote.
I texted Adam. I was like, this is like 3 episodes. We weren't even halfway through the Simmons one. And I was like, this is 3 episodes worth of the podcast. Like, it's just that good. So let's get to Durant, but I just in general, I do agree with you that this not often will these things have any real bearing, I don't think, on what actually happens with a team. I do think in this case it does. I do think in this case, this tone, this energy, this honesty from Durant and then all the way down the rest of the group that took the podium or the table, you can't ask for anything more from something that's non-game related.
Yep. We'll come back to that at the end of the episode, because you don't often feel like you won something when it's not a game that happened on the basketball court. And yet I feel like there's a victory. There's a victory here. I think we're 1-0. Brooklyn Nets are officially 1-0 before the season starts. So Kevin Durant,
real quick, because they could have easily been 0-1. Like, this would have been the easiest. This would have been the easiest day. You could definitely lose. You can rarely win, but you can definitely lose. And this easily could have been, for Durant and everybody else, a loss. And it wouldn't have taken much. Like, it really wouldn't have taken much at all. One misstep, one wrong quote, one reporter throwing a guy off their game a little bit, whatever. It really wouldn't have taken much to just have this whole thing kind of cascade down like an avalanche, and it just didn't happen.
Yep. So the Kevin Durant takes the podium first, the stands, the microphone, whatever. He's there in his chair and he's got a mic in his hand, and they're asking him questions. And obviously the first one comes up is the trade request, right? What led to the trade request? Why did you make it? And I'm just going to contextualize it by saying, paraphrasing some of Kevin Durant's responses over a couple of questions. But basically, he felt like they were building towards something in that second round playoff loss to the Milwaukee Bucks 2 seasons ago. That was the cusp of, okay, everything is coming to a head here. We're going to really have some success. And then things start to fall apart. Injuries, mandates, trade requests, all of these different elements over the course of last season. As Kevin Durant said, it wasn't really my place to bring it up during the year. I try to go out, perform at a high level, and then when it was the appropriate time in the offseason, voice some of my concerns. And that's, he thought, was the best way to be handling that. And in that regard, you respect it, because you don't want to hear Kevin Durant disgruntled mid-season. That's only going to ramp up speculation, and it's only going to detract from whatever possibilities you have of being successful. But essentially, he said he went in, had some doubts over the past season, and he voiced those to Joe Tsai. But ultimately, he liked what Sean Marks did this offseason, liked what the organization did this offseason, and felt comfortable coming back. There's a follow-up there as well. But just initially, do you feel like the way that Kevin Durant encapsulated at least the response of why the trade request, it wasn't just this knee-jerk reaction in the offseason.
Yeah.
This was the culmination of an entire season and maybe even the offseason prior that had this growing concern for him. And we'll flesh out reasons why more here in a second.
And I think we kind of knew that, right? We knew that to be obvious. We knew it to be the season. While it was frustrating to hear that he wanted the trade request at the time, it was at least grounded in something, right? Like it wasn't totally crazy to not, like it wasn't just totally crazy. The season was a real problem. And he mentions a few other pieces around, expectations of what he thought the team was going to be. And it was already looked different by the time the season ended, right? And that is a reasonable thing. I think he probably left a little on the table with some of these responses, which was like the frustration level was clearly way higher than he probably let on during this media stuff, just because because he's past it now and there's no reason to go all the way back through the emotions and stuff. So I think a little bit of that was left out there, but I think that's fine because once at this point he's trying to move on from it. So, and making the best taking the best opportunity to try to do that. So I think a little bit he probably held back on his overall frustration level with the team, which was obviously at DEFCON 5 or whatever the worst DEFCON is. I think the higher the DEFCON
11.
Well, it might be 1 is like the worst. Anyway, whatever DEFCON's the worst, like was clearly that's where Durant was at that
Threat
time.
level midnight.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. Threat level midnight. Oh, one of the great the great underproduced classics of our time. So I think obviously there, but that's expected. He's not going to just go back and throw everyone back onto the bus because that's not the point. So him stating pretty clearly it was different. I don't want to bring it up in the moment. This was my best chance to do it. Makes total sense. But and like I said, if there was anything that he probably left out a little of the emotion, but I think I'm fine with that. Well, I know we're going to get to more KD quotes here in a second. First, going to tell you about our friends over at betonline.net, your number one source for football betting info this season. You can find all the latest player developments, the team matchups, the news, the podcast. They got basketball over there too. Basketball is already up for the first game of the season. Nets -4.5 against the Pelicans. Take that, New Orleans, Zion. We don't care. Neither does Bet Online. As always, Bet Online remains your continued source for all sports wagering information, live betting, up to the minute scores. Got every sport out there. If you're rolling through MLB toward the end of the season, obviously that's there. MMA, boxing, golf, it's all there on betonline.net. You can go over, you can sign up, you can learn about all the trends, all the action. Bet Online, where the game starts.
Let's keep it right rolling here because there's plenty to get to when it comes to Kevin Durant. Followed up around the trade request. Were you disappointed not to be traded? Kevin Durant responded, nah, I'm doing what I love to do. So from that lens, coming in here, still have a great team. It was not going to affect me in terms of how I prepared and how I looked at this season coming up here. So I think ultimately, and I'll tie in this one comment that he added from Sean Marks when he said about the trade request. He said, as much as was insinuated over the course of this offseason and around the trade request, that Sean said, we don't want to trade you. Like you are too talented. And I think that's a nice way to be able to give yourself a pat on the back, rightfully so, saying like, I know how good I am and I know how hard it is to move me. So that also, I think, fleshed out this idea of, okay, you put in a trade request, but you understand why the team doesn't want to give you up and why they want to try to figure out things, why they want to extend these conversations. And sometimes the request in and of itself that starts that next step of discussions inside the organization is also a good thing, right? Where were you? Why are you frustrated? Why are we at this point? We get it. We don't want to give you up. And this is the way that we think we can get ourselves back on track.
Which, again, in the old was always obvious camp, which we talked about the entire time, was that, you don't trade him for nothing. Thankfully, the organization didn't just bend over. It is a funny sort of, not even backhanded, it's just a funny sort of compliment to say, we would trade you. You're just too good. Yep. Right? Like, it'd be great. We would want to honor the request if the right thing comes around. You just happen to be too good that we have to be overwhelmed by a package. And so they are complimenting you in not honoring the thing that you want to happen. That was specifically the way it worked out. It's clear that Durant understands this always too. Like, no one is more aware of his own like sort of ranking and talent. Durant is very aware of this. And he's happy to tell anybody about it. And it's actually not bragging. It's just true. He's happy to tell you in a way that, he loves basketball. It's why we always knew or always suspected that he would not be able to just kind of be on the team and sit out or tank games, like sort of like we saw with Harden last season. Like, he would not have it in him. We always believed, at least, that he would not have it in him to do that. These responses are confirmation of that. It's like, I'm good. The organization needed to get more because I'm too good. They didn't get it. I'm good. And let's move on. Right. Like, so I think again, it does reaffirm things that we already knew about this dude, who is very aware of how good he is. He knows it. He will go into Twitter and he's happy to remind people it's not, but again, it's not bragging. It's like, this is just true.
It's not bragging if it's just a fact, right? Like you can't be bragging if you're just like, no, I'm one of the best players in the game. And when you see people insinuating that somehow this past year and a half or however much time is now an indication of where the state of your game is relative to what a narrative may be. A quick little just note here around this before I get to something that I thought was interesting when it comes to the organization and what Kevin Durant wants for this organization over the remainder of his contract, which he also balked back at a question around that. But so a reporter asked how other players, top players from the outside, might be looking in here with what you're trying to accomplish in the offseason. You have a trade request. Do people want to come in? I like that he kind of pushed that back on that too, because he said, first of all, he essentially said, I don't care what other players. It's not my problem. I'm one of the best players. We have Kyrie Irving, one of the best players. We have Ben Simmons, one of the best players. And he complimented what Sean Marks and the organization accomplished in the offseason, the players that they brought in. Remember, go back to last year when he said, it's a wing-driven league. Well, even if there's some guys that are coming off of injuries, etc., you brought in TJ Warren and Markieff Morris and Yuta Watanabe and Edmund Sumner. Like, you brought in a new crop of players, and that ties in directly to what I thought was telling about where his frustrations lied going back to last season. And that's when he was asked about it, when he went out with his injury, the Nets went on to lose 10 straight games. And I think here's the difference between when you talk about a player being the best player, one of the best players in the league, and understanding, hey, I am, of course, going to be the catalyst for this. But this sounds like this was from the sidelines, Kevin Durant getting a perspective of, I don't know if we have all the right pieces in place here to still be successful. He referenced Steph Curry in Golden State. When he was injured, the team still found ways to win. He referenced Luka in Dallas, still found ways to win. So when he was away from this team, and you have a lot of young players, but then veteran players that just were not able to carry their weight the way they were a year prior, that I think was the first time where then he probably started to build this sense of, it's not just about what my expectations are for myself, but it's about that all the pieces fit together here. And that feels like the catalyst for the moves that were made here this offseason, and maybe that coming to a head of the frustration he was having.
Yeah, and there was obviously some context around some of that stuff. I mean, they had traded Harden and they didn't get well, I guess he was already hurt before that. But like, Harden was on his way out and they didn't get Simmons back, and the Kyrie thing was kind of working itself out and all this other stuff. And I think he mentioned at some point, or I know he mentioned at some point during this presser, he said, we skipped some steps, about like how things just weren't.
And he said he said, I want everyone to be held accountable. And, he says, like, I know what I'm doing here. And this is one of those things where you can have superstars that don't look at preparation and how you approach a game and how you approach preparing for a season the way that Kevin Durant does. And that, I think, is what permeates here. And it made me think about, we all loved Bruce Brown. And I'm not saying there wasn't a high level energy player and doing all the right things. We all love some of the veterans, etc. But when he's away, regardless of Harden and Kyrie and everything else, just looking at the preparation that players were putting into this process and saying, I need guys that have a similar mentality to me when it comes to what we want here. And that feathered out into his comments around the organization. He wants the organization to be respected throughout the league, on the court, from the GM level all the way down to the equipment manager. Like, from the high level perspective of what he wants for the organization, and the thing that he balked at quickly here was when they said, how can Nets fans be reassured that a year from now you aren't going to request something? He said, I don't have anything to prove. They can either be on board with what I am in my process, but he wants to be here. And I thought that quote was really telling about, we said this when he signed, legacy piece for Kevin Durant. Like, he can make a legacy around what he accomplishes with Kyrie Irving and the Brooklyn Nets over the life of this contract. And that ties into it. He doesn't want, I'm on a team. I want this team to be known as one of the best in the league on the court and off the court, not a 3-ring circus with total chaos. It's seemingly at all levels, which happened this past year.
Yeah, and he's got a point, right? Because he's like, you can't argue with what I did when I was on the court. Like, if we're talking about who upheld their ends of the bargain, Durant upheld his end of the bargain. Like, he averaged 30 points. He played 1 million minutes when he actually played. He was close to 50, 40, 90 guy again last season. Like, he just missed he needed to hit like 7 threes in the last game to be able to get there or something like that. I mean, he didn't get there, but it was close. He wouldn't have qualified because he didn't play enough games. And that's the knock you want to make on him. then that's a knock. Like he has been somewhat injury prone here, but he has a point also where he's like, hey, at some point, everyone else, it's got to be better on everyone else's part because I can only do so much. And he's not wrong by saying that.
You know what I found? You know what I found fascinating too? He mentioned along these questions here, he mentioned the word culture. Like he brought up that word culture. And for as funny as it is when we've talked about it in the past of, the Nets organization pre-superstars, we're building a culture and we want certain character guys. And then you get the superstars and, you make certain sacrifices. And it doesn't mean that term has to shift its definition. But we all thought this past off season, when you and I were talking about it, that the organization was trying to get back some level of control here. They want to bring back that idea of culture. And I thought overall out of this media day for Kevin Durant, I actually think that genuinely did attract him to the Brooklyn Nets and wanting to be a part of this, because his definition of culture is practice what you preach.
Yeah.
I do exactly what I say I'm going to do. I want the team and everyone involved here to do those same things for me. And maybe we lost sight of that a little bit over this past year, understanding everything that went on, but it seems like that got lost in the sauce a little bit. And obviously we want to get to one thing that maybe wasn't addressed fully, although he did make a reference to specifically the coaching and to Steve Nash here that I thought also was positive in the road ahead here when we're talking about how can this team be successful.
Yeah, and in taking like accountability too along those lines, like of just the culture piece, which I think has to do with accountability and has to do with leadership and things like that. And it's funny because we talked about this a ton, but culture, I think it's both of our definitions, but at least I'll say it for me, is that culture in the NBA usually means just winning more games than people expect you to do. Then you have good culture or getting a little
culture. By the way, is so insulting in a lot of ways to like the players that achieve that thing. Cause you're like, man, must've been the great culture. It can't just be that a group of players played better, right? Like that's just like a sidebar, but I know
one's usually a byproduct of the other. It's like when you are a good team and you have good culture, you end up doing better. So it's not mutually exclusive ideas. Like they are bred on top of each other. But in terms of taking, and I'll get to the Nash thing in a second, but in terms of taking responsibility too, there was a point of this talk where he said we effed up. And he said, we I don't want to say the word because I don't want to get, even quoting somebody, I don't want to get the explicit tag here, but he used the full word.
Not worried about that on a live media session. On the
all good. I appreciate it. Cause he was like, we effed up here. Like we probably, in the playoffs, we got swept. That's unacceptable. The organization wasn't at the place that we needed to be, but he said we. And when you say we, you're taking ownership on a situation that you at least see yourself as having a hand in. And I think that as much as he mentions that the organization maybe was a little off the rails, which they were over the part of last season, he's happy to put it on himself too and say, at the end of the day, I'm the one on the court. I'm paraphrasing now. I'm the one on the court, and that in the end is where things have to stop. And he was on the court for the Celtics series, and they got swept. And so I think when he says that, it's a reference to sort of like the whole season went on, but it's also, I think, an admission that because usually when you can tell where things went wrong, if you're able to admit it, you are at least less likely to have it occur again. It might happen again. Right. But if you can
self-awareness of what your role was in that,
it's when you don't identify the problems that you're almost definitely going to do it again. Like that's just a general human trait. When you don't get what happened, or you think it's someone else's fault, it's a near guarantee that whatever happened will happen again if you had something to do with it. That this feels like not that situation when he says something like, hey, we effed up organizationally, player on every level. And once you recognize it, it makes you feel better that it's not going to happen again.
Before we get to the Steve Nash component of this, there was one thing, not to say that we need to offer some type of negative comment to come out of this, and it isn't even negative, but I found it interesting. I wouldn't expect any player at Kevin Durant's level to necessarily respond any differently, but he was asked about how are you approaching this off season and the way you're preparing for the upcoming year based on what occurred last season, whether it's, the injuries or the way things went in the playoffs against the Boston Celtics. Now, on the one hand, we can just say, well, Kyrie wasn't available. It's total disaster, right? You can write it off as just being like, it was a mess and it didn't matter. It wasn't going to work out. And yet in those games, we talked a lot about the impact that the Celtics defense had on Kevin Durant. You can talk about the supporting cast and how that can help things out. Do you find it interesting that Durant said nothing really changes for me in the way I prep? It only comes down to, which I just found interesting, who I work out with, which is you want to be in LA. That's where all the biggest stars work out. Sometimes he works with veterans. Sometimes he works with college guys. Primarily, he said over the last decade, he's worked with a lot of the superstar talent from around the NBA. Do you think that he should have any sense of like areas of my game that I want to improve? And I'm not suggesting that he isn't improving his game, but there was at least this very small sample size in that Celtics series that suggested, hey, they came at you in a different way than maybe you had seen. There must be you have the code to crack it. It's just a matter of applying it. And maybe that is the simple answer, that he knows he can take care of that issue. It's just by the time you come to the end of that long season and everything else, it was almost like waving the white flag in some circumstances. Like, I don't want to get beat up for 7 games in this. I'm okay to reboot for next year.
Yeah, they were just so undermanned at that point and like just sort of ill-conceived with the players that they actually had on the court that it's hard to put too much on him. I know that he'd also just been playing. He played 1 million minutes up into that when he wasn't hurt. They had rested everything on his shoulders. The Celtics definitely had a plan and had a group of players that were sort of, perfectly situated to kind of deal with him, right? And there was multiple guys on the Nets team that you just didn't have to worry about at all. And when that's going to be the case, it's always going to be super hard. And when you basically have 2.5 other offensive players at all times on the court that no one has to pay any attention to, like, it's going to be easy to defend. Like, I think just by the nature of how the team looks this year, that won't be a problem. With Durant, I'm not an apologist because they don't have to be an apologist. I'm basically always on a side with this stuff.
Somebody else. I mean, any superstar player.
It is.
It's usually someone else's problem, not LeBron's, not Embiid's, not XYZ.
Look, at some point you get to the highest level and like there's only one championship and you just got to be better than everyone else. And Durant has done that in the past. And I know people are going to take cracks at him for like who he did it with, but he has done it. Did he do it last year? No, but I'll never fault. Of all the places to lay blame for last season, like he is so far down the list that I wouldn't be within the first 10, right? And so, and I think what you saw from this press conference is that he knew that too. It was like,
so let's get to then this big component of it, because that's I think a part of it, right? And so there's a couple of things. These aren't footnotes, but we're going to talk about it, I think, more when we cover Kyrie Irving as far as what went on with his extension, etc. Clarifying the information that we kind of heard and what Kevin Durant had said at the end of last year. He doesn't get involved in the higher level stuff. He reiterated, I've never once walked into the GM's office, into the owner's office and said, I want this or that or the other. Now we can notate that he maybe walked in and said, I want to trade, or I want you to, take care of the GM and the head coach. But if we take him at his word, he's not directly involved in that, said they have to handle that the way that they will. But to your point about you're seeing these things unfold if you're Kevin Durant, and you're just noticing, man, this isn't necessarily going the way I want. This isn't working out. And again, when it came to the injury and maybe being able to not physically be on the court and see the way things were being executed, that was a part of the conversation that he said he had with the owner, Joe Tsai, with the GM, Sean Marks, and with Steve Nash. And he said, and Steve agreed with me, that like things needed to be better. Things needed to be operating better. I think that can be reassuring as far as just where the team is headed coming into this season. And I wonder if that's a two-way street around Steve Nash saying, yes, it needs to be better. We weren't planning on using all these rookies, whatever, but we do need to come together. This needs to be more of a joint process. And I mean that legitimately in a two-way street. Obviously, Kevin Durant's going to like what he wants to do, but there needs to be a willingness to say, now with an improved personnel around you, we can execute a better version of our offense, a real version of an NBA offense.
Yeah, I mean, and that's going to be the great hope for this whole season, right? Is that like with better personnel, things can improve. I think that Nash has to make strides. I think there's probably things that he did. I think there's clear holes in his coaching game. Let's put it this way. There's more holes in Nash's coaching game than there are in Kevin Durant's basketball game, right? So like, if you're just trying to think about,
it feels fair.
I don't think I'm speaking crazy here. And that's not even necessarily a knock on Nash, except that we just already know what KD is. I think that everything always looks better when there's the complete version of something that you had in your mind's eye, right? The Nets never got there last season for a lot of different reasons. We already saw what the complete version of it had looked like a season before in a brief time, and it was awesome. It's going to be a new thing this year. I get what he's saying with Nash. It was, Nash kind of has to say that in terms of, okay, well, we all have to do this together. And it's like, there have to be areas of improvement. And like, as long as they're on the same page about that, which it really sounds, and like just, overlooking what Nash is talking about now, they're all at least saying the correct things here. Let's get 10 games into the season and see how everyone feels.
Yep.
But just to kind of like put a pin on it, that even comment about Nash is like, look, we already know what happened here. It seems like you guys were at odds. You probably were. Nash, mentioned something about it being akin to family fighting. If you want to just smooth it over that way.
I don't hate, by the way, which I don't hate.
Again, what are you going to say? What are you going to say? Like, it already happened. The cat's out of the bag. Like, you just can't, you can't pretend like all this other stuff didn't happen. Something was clearly very wrong.
Yeah.
Right. Mom and dad got in a fight. Now, like, good news. We're all living in the same house still. Right. So like, we're going to try to work it out. But I think the way they addressed it, and specifically how I addressed it with Nash, was honest without taking anyone down a peg and with just being rational about a situation that had clearly gone bad. And I actually, at that point, don't know what else you say.
No, and as we'll get out of here, and I think shout out to everybody inside of the live YouTube that we ran over there. Thought it'd be fun to get this out to everyone, especially on YouTube, as quick as possible. Stay tuned for maybe a couple of more of these before the season officially kicks off. I think at the very least, from a Kevin Durant perspective, you never had the sense over any of this or over the course of his career. I think that he has a level of respect for the other players on the team with him, the coaches, the GM, I think that that's all legitimate. And when you hear the way he speaks about it, it would have been easy, as we said at the top, to sit here and say, these are the reasons that it went wrong or whatever, and put out those tea leaves that, yes, I'm still here, but it's not necessarily what I wanted. I'm not comfortable with it. I don't like it. And there's still an end goal for me that does not involve being a part of the Brooklyn Nets. Instead, it very much sounded like, hey, I get why they wanted to keep me. I like some of the things that we did in the offseason. We know there's stuff that we can improve. And I look at this team with Kyrie Irving, Ben Simmons, and the supporting cast, and myself, most importantly, and feel like we are as good as any team in the league, and we can win a lot of basketball games and try to get a championship. Like, I think if you're Kevin Durant, if you're being honest with yourself, then you can feel good about coming into the season still being a Brooklyn Net.
Totally. All I heard from these comments, by the way, was 82-0. That's what it's going to be. That's how good I'm feeling right now.
I heard MVP. I heard comeback player of the year.
Yeah, the whole thing. We just run the table. Most improved, comeback, and an MVP. Total sweep. Now, okay, look, we got a full episode coming about Kyrie Irving here, because I thought Kyrie Irving's press conference was kind of fascinating also, and mostly pretty positive. So take it there. I love the Simmons one too, because we obviously got to hear about him, or hear what he had to say from the Redick podcast, but he got up there, interrupted a bunch of reporters and answered, which I always appreciate. It's like, I already know what you're going to ask. Here comes the answer. You don't need to get the full sentence.
We'll save it. But yeah, only version of these high level player interviews where they didn't do the thing where they asked interesting questions. They only asked Ben Simmons two very specific questions in different versions repeatedly for his time.
And he would just start answering halfway through, which I always love. That's a page out of Doug Norrie's playbook when he's talking with just about anybody. It's like, I already have the answer. You don't need to get to the end of your sentence. Okay, we are going to get out of here. Go check out the other YouTube videos. We'll have them up over before the end of tomorrow for sure, breaking down the rest of Nets Media Day. In the meantime, really saw a nice little spike in YouTube subscribers just over the day. So really appreciate everyone that's jumped on here over the last couple days, and everyone who's been with us from the beginning. The best way to help the podcast is just hit subscribe on YouTube. It's totally free. Hit subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, Spotify, Apple, wherever, totally free. Those are the number one ways. Really appreciate it. Go do that now. Like and subscribe, YouTube, wherever you listen to podcasts.
What up, Guillermo? What up, Wolfpack? What up, Al Mack? Thank you again for being in on the live stream. We really appreciate it. And hey, after 3 years of writing, 1 year of shooting, 4 years of reshooting, and 2 years of editing, I have finally completed my movie, Threat Level Midnight. Michael Scott.
One of the all-time great poets. We will be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.